She walked in wearing jeans. They laughed her out the door. But what they didn't know was she owned the power to change everything. Humiliation sparked a quiet fire, and by morning, justice would arrive in $1 million Rolls Royce. If you were hooked, make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow we got another story that will leave you stunned. The glass door slid open quietly, letting in a warm patch of sunlight that stretched across the polished showroom floor. Maggie Collins walked in without hesitation. She wore a plain white t-shirt, a pair of jeans that had clearly been through years of use, and comfortable sneakers. Her brown hair was tied back in a simple ponytail. Nothing about her said wealth, and that's exactly what caught their attention. The room didn't stop, but it noticed. A salesman glanced up from behind a Bentley and raised an eyebrow. Another one leaned over and whispered something to his co-worker, who chuckled. Maggie caught the sideways looks, the subtle shifts in posture, the eyes that moved past her like she didn't belong. No one said anything directly, but the message was loud and clear. You're in the wrong place. She kept walking. Maggie wasn't here to impress anyone. She wasn't dressed to turn heads or win approval. She had a reason to be there, a car she wanted to buy for her sister, who had just beaten cancer. That's what mattered. She'd been judged by her looks before. Too simple, too quiet, too plain. But underneath the modest clothes and soft voice was a woman who had built a life helping others. Founder of a children's foundation, grant writer, advocate, caregiver. None of it showed on the outside, but was there in every step she took. She stopped in front of a sleek midnight blue coupe and studied it carefully. They could underestimate her all they wanted. She wasn't here to prove anything. She was here to make a purchase. "Good morning," Maggie said gently, her voice steady as she approached a young salesman near the front desk. The young man, probably no older than 25, looked up with a polite smile. "Hi there. Welcome to Boston Luxury Motors. I'm Daniel. Can I help you with something today?" Maggie nodded and gestured toward a sleek, midnight blue coupe on a raised platform. "Yes, I'm interested in that one. It's for my sister's birthday." Daniel was about to speak when a voice cut in smoothly from behind him. "I'll take it from here, Daniel." The voice belonged to a man in a perfectly tailored navy suit. His name tag read Blake Thompson, sales manager. He smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. Blake turned to Maggie and gave her a quick once-over. T-shirt, jeans, sneakers. His smile grew tighter. "Looking for directions, ma'am?" he asked, polite on the surface, dismissive underneath. "No," Maggie replied, calm but firm. "I'm actually interested in that coupe." Blake's brows lifted ever so slightly, the corners of his mouth twitching like he was holding back a laugh. "That's the Azure, limited edition. Only 15 made this year." His tone made it sound like a warning, not a selling point. Maggie nodded again, unfazed. "I'd like to know more about it." "Well," he said slowly, "vehicles like that are typically shown by appointment. Our serious buyers usually schedule private viewings." The word serious hung in the air like a quiet accusation. Behind him, a couple in designer clothes walked in. Instantly, Blake's posture straightened, his smile widened, and he all but forgot Maggie was standing there. "Please excuse me," he said, already walking away. "Daniel can get you a brochure." Maggie stood silently, watching him greet the couple like old friends. Within seconds, he was escorting them straight to the same car she'd asked about, the one that was apparently appointment only. Daniel returned to her side, clearly uncomfortable. "I'm really sorry about that," he said quietly. "Would you still like to hear about the Azure?" "Yes, thank you," Maggie replied, her voice still soft. As Daniel began listing the specs, Maggie watched in the corner of her eye as Blake opened the car door with theatrical gesture, inviting the woman to sit inside. He was selling a dream, just not to her. A few minutes later, she approached again. "Excuse me," she said, addressing Blake directly. "I was hoping to inquire about purchasing this model." Blake turned, the smile gone now. "As I mentioned earlier, this vehicle is being shown to these customers," he said, his tone clipped. "Perhaps you could come back another time. Or," he added, gesturing vaguely in the air, "check out our used car lot. It's a few blocks east." Maggie took a slow breath, her pulse quickening. I'm interested in this one, specifically, she said. I'd like to make a purchase today. Blake blinked, then laughed. Not out of amusement, but disbelief, loud enough that a few heads turned. A cash purchase? For that car? He asked, voice rising just enough. Look, ma'am, this isn't a yard sale. That car costs more than a house. She stood still, her face unreadable, but her cheeks were burning. I believe my money is as good as anyone's, she said quietly. Blake stepped closer, not threatening, but towering, condescending. Let me be clear, he said. You're wasting my time. And frankly, you're embarrassing yourself. Either come back with an appointment and dress appropriately, or please leave the premises. Silence spread through the showroom. Daniel stood frozen. The designer couple shifted uncomfortably. A few customers nearby pretended not to listen, but they were listening. Maggie looked around and saw exactly what she expected. Smirks, sidelong glances, a few whispered comments. She'd been here before. Her dignity stayed intact. But something inside her cracked. Not from shame, but from weariness. How many times had she walked into a room only to be treated like less? She turned to go. Behind her, someone murmured, "Some people just don't know their place." Outside, the sunlight hit her face, and for a moment she closed her eyes. The words stung, but not because they were new. They were familiar, and they were wrong. She pulled out her phone, her fingers steady. The voice in her head wasn't angry. It was resolute. They need to learn. The gates of the Collins estate opened silently as Maggie drove up the long gravel path, flanked by tall oaks and blooming azaleas. The house, elegant but not ostentatious, sat peacefully under the early afternoon sun. It was a kind of home where silence wasn't empty. It was full of intention. She stepped inside and headed straight for the office. Alexander Collins, her husband of 15 years, was seated at his desk, reviewing architectural plans for a solar project in South Asia. When he looked up and saw her, he set everything aside immediately. Something in her expression gave him pause. He stood, walked around the desk, and gently placed his hands on her shoulders. "What happened?" Maggie sank into the leather armchair near the window, hands folded in her lap. "I went to the dealership." His brow furrowed. "I found the car," she said softly. "The exact one I wanted for Caroline. Midnight blue coupe. She'd love it." "But," he asked, already sensing what lay beneath her calm tone. She exhaled slowly, the memory still fresh. "They didn't think I belonged there. I was invisible at first, then dismissed. Mocked, really. The sales manager. He looked at me like I was wasting his time." Alexander didn't speak right away. He knew better than to interrupt her when she was processing. Her voice was steady, but he recognized the ache behind it. "It's not the first time," she said, her eyes meeting his, "and I know it won't be the last. But today, it wasn't just the way he treated me. It was the way no one challenged him. No one thought twice about assuming I couldn't possibly be a real customer." Alexander's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "Do you want to call them?" She shook her head. "This isn't about revenge. I don't need to prove anything to them. I walked out with my dignity. That's enough for me." He knelt beside her, resting one hand gently on her knee. "But it's not just about you, is it?" "No," she said quietly. "That's what bothers me the most. I think about people who face this kind of judgment every day. People without the luxury of walking away and knowing the truth about their own worth." He nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. "So what do you want to do?" She was quiet for a moment, then smiled faintly. "Part of me wants to just buy the car somewhere else and move on. But the other part, the part that believes in teaching without shaming, thinks maybe they need to learn something. Not to be punished, but to be reminded." "Reminded of what?" "That value isn't worn on the outside," she said, "and that humility is a weakness." Alexander leaned back, his expression thoughtful. "Then maybe it's time for a small lesson. Not the kind that screams. The kind that whispers, but stays with you." Maggie raised an eyebrow. "Just don't go by in the dealership." He laughed softly. Tempting, but no, something a little more meaningful. She stood and walked to the window, arms folded gently across her chest. Outside, the garden shimmered in soft light. Let them see what real character looks like, not through a headline, through experience. Alexander followed her gaze. Would you like to be there? She shook her head. This isn't about them seeing me differently. It's about them seeing people differently. But I do expect a full report. He smiled, then pulled out his phone and started dialing. The next morning, the showroom at Boston Luxury Motors gleamed under strategic lighting. Blake Thompson arrived early, his steps confident, his blue tie perfectly knotted. The incident with the jeans woman had already faded into the back of his mind. Just another awkward moment with someone who didn't understand how things worked. He gave the team his usual morning speech. Remember, we cater to a certain clientele. Qualify quickly. Time is money. At exactly 10:17 a.m., conversations across the showroom hushed. Heads turned toward the glass entrance. A low, elegant hum rose from the street as a custom midnight blue Rolls Royce Phantom pulled up, its finish catching the morning light like polished sapphire. The doors opened, and a man stepped out, tall, composed, impeccably dressed. The air seemed to shift around him, not because he demanded it, but because he carried himself with the kind of quiet power that needed no announcement. Blake moved quickly, already rehearsing his pitch. Good morning, sir. Blake Thompson, sales manager. Welcome to Boston Luxury Motors. We'd be honored to. I'm Alexander Collins, the man replied, shaking Blake's hand firmly but briefly. I believe we met yesterday. Indirectly. Blake blinked, trying to place the name. I'm sorry, I don't believe we've. My wife visited your dealership, Alexander continued, tone calm but precise. Margaret Collins. She was wearing jeans and a white t-shirt. She inquired about a specific vehicle. Realization hit Blake like cold water. Ah, yes, I remember now. I believe I directed her to the used car lot, Alexander said, his voice still even, after suggesting she didn't belong here, after laughing at her when she offered a cash purchase. The silence in the showroom grew heavier by the second. Daniel, the younger salesman, stood nearby, looking pale but firm. There must have been a misunderstanding, Blake offered, his words rushing out. There wasn't, Daniel said quietly. She was respectful, clear about what she wanted, and she was dismissed. Blake shot him a glare, but it didn't matter. The truth was already out. Alexander turned toward Richard Mason, the dealership's owner, who had emerged from his office, sensing trouble. My wife, Alexander said clearly, runs one of the largest foundations for children with disabilities on the East Coast. She dresses simply by choice, because she believes kindness, not clothing, defines people. Richard stammered, Mr. Collins, please accept our apologies. We had no idea. That's the point, Alexander interrupted, his tone still controlled, but now tinged with steel. You had no idea who she was, and you treated her like she didn't matter, not because of her words, but because of her wardrobe. He paused, letting the weight of that statement settle. This isn't about one sale, or one person. It's about a culture, one that judges too quickly and listens too little. Blake, flushed and silent now, stood with his hands at his sides. For the first time, he had nothing clever to say. I won't be buying a fleet today, Alexander said, turning to Daniel, but I will purchase the Azure. I'd like you to handle the sale. Daniel nodded, stunned. And Blake, Alexander added, facing him fully now, my wife asked for awareness, not punishment. So here's what we propose. He handed Richard a folded brochure. Our foundation is hosting a children's adaptive sports gala next month. We need volunteers, not guests. Blake opened his mouth, then closed it. No words came. We believe in second chances, Alexander said, his voice softening, but only when they're earned. And just like that, he turned away, walking toward the car he had come to buy. No drama, no vengeance, just truth, delivered with dignity. 1 month later, the grand ballroom of the Boston Hotel shimmered with soft lights and gentle music. Children in wheelchairs laughed as they chased balloons, while volunteers in matching shirts guided them with care. Laughter echoed against marble pillars, and the smell of warm food and fresh flowers lingered in the air. Blake Thompson stood near the entrance, dressed not in his usual sharp suit, but in a simple event volunteer vest. A clipboard in hand, he directed guests, offered juice boxes to toddlers, and knelt beside a young boy named Thomas to help him adjust the straps on his adaptive basketball chair. "Mister," Blake, Thomas grinned, "you still shoot like a grandpa." Blake laughed. "Then I'll need you to keep coaching me." Across the room, Maggie Collins arrived quietly, her dress as understated as ever. She noticed Blake and made her way over. He stood where he saw her, more nervous than he expected. "Mrs. Collins," he began, "I know I've said it in writing, but thank you for the chance to be here." Maggie smiled kindly. "How's it going?" Blake looked around. "It's humbling and necessary. I thought I knew people. Turns out I only knew appearances." She nodded. "And what do you know now?" He paused. "That dignity has nothing to do with what someone wears. That respect should never be a reward. It should be the default." Maggie looked toward Thomas, who was now wheeling over to meet another child. "He likes you." "I like him too," Blake said quietly. "He's shown me more about resilience than any adult ever has." Across the room, Alexander Collins joined them, resting a gentle hand on his wife's shoulder. "Blake's been mentoring new volunteers," he said. "And Daniel mentioned he's been helping restructure their customer training at the dealership." Blake looked down, then back up. "I'm still learning, but I want to keep learning." Maggie smiled. "Then you're already ahead of most." As the music swelled and laughter continued, the moment didn't feel like redemption. It felt like beginning again, with eyes and heart wide open. We all judge, sometimes without meaning to. A look, a word, a silence. They can speak volumes about what we assume of others. But what if we paused, even just for a moment, to look deeper? This story isn't just about a woman in jeans or a salesman in a suit. It's about how we see value, and how often we mistake appearance for worth. Maggie didn't need to raise her voice to be heard, and Blake didn't need punishment to change. What made the difference was compassion with conviction and a willingness to learn. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Look around, at your workplace, your neighborhood, your daily choices. Who have you overlooked? Who might need someone to believe in them, simply because no one else does? Kindness is quiet but powerful. Respect is free but rare. And change begins when one person decides to see differently. If this message resonates with you, share it, talk about it, live it, because the world doesn't just need more success stories. It needs more people willing to rewrite them. In a world where appearances are too often mistaken for truth, where assumptions replace understanding and quiet voices go unheard, the story of Maggie Collins stands out as one of those rare emotional stories that lingers in the heart long after the last word is read. For older American audiences, those who weathered life seasons and witnessed the sweeping changes of society, this tale doesn't just entertain. It teaches, it reminds, and most of all, it heals. Maggie's journey, told the kind of narrated stories that echo real-life experience, is the epitome of grace under pressure. A woman walking into a luxury car dealership in jeans and a t-shirt may not seem like the beginning of an incredible story, but that's precisely the beauty of it. Like so many touching stories from our own lives, it starts quietly. No drama, no spotlight, just a woman with purpose in her heart and kindness in her soul, doing something selfless, buying a dream car for her sister, who had just overcome cancer. But as is often the case in life, Maggie isn't welcomed with warmth. She's met with side eyes and smirks, the silent snubs that speak louder than words. It's an experience many of us, especially in our later years, recognize all too well. Being dismissed, underestimated, looked through rather than seen. And yet, instead of responding with bitterness or confrontation, Maggie chooses a higher road. Her dignity, tested but unbroken, becomes a quiet force behind this heartwarming story. This isn't just a tale of right and wrong. It's a justice story, but not the kind you'll find in courtrooms or headlines. This is about the waves of justice that ripple when someone decides to respond to judgment not with vengeance, but with awareness. Maggie doesn't demand apologies or lawsuits. Instead, she simply walks away with the grace of someone who knows her worth, and then plants a seed of change in a world that sorely needs it. What unfolds next is where the true magic of the story lies. Her husband, Alexander, enters the picture not as a savior, but as a partner in principle. His calm, measured confrontation of the dealership's culture is one of the most powerful moments in the story. Not because he's wealthy or influential, though he is, but because he speaks a truth that resonates across generations. Kindness is not a luxury. Respect is not optional. And appearances mean nothing without character. For those of us who live long enough to understand that the loudest voices aren't always the wisest, this moment strikes a chord. We've seen Unraveled Fates, watched as people reveal their true selves not in moment of triumph, but in how they treated others when no one was watching. And in Alexander's dignified call for compassion and accountability, we're reminded that justice doesn't always need a gavel. Sometimes, it needs a volunteer vest and a second chance. The transformation of Blake, the sales manager, is perhaps the most unexpected and moving part of the story. In many narrated stories, the villain remains unchanged. But here, we see a different kind of redemption, one earned through humility, not humiliation. Watching him serve juice boxes to children, kneel to adjust a wheelchair strap, and receive a lesson in resilience from a boy named Thomas is more than satisfying. It's restorative. It reminds us that people can change when given the right reason to. This tale also offers a subtle but powerful lesson in what true wealth looks like. Maggie, with her unassuming clothing and soft-spoken manner, turns out to be the richest soul in the room, not because of her bank account, but because of her heart. Her life's work, running a foundation for children with disabilities, is the kind of legacy that doesn't need a spotlight. It's written in the smiles of the children she's helped, in the quiet gratitude of families, and in the new lens through which others now see the world. For older adults, especially those who felt the sting of being overlooked, this story validates those experiences while offering hope. It reminds us that no matter our age, we still have the power to open minds and soften hearts. We still have the power to teach, not through lectures, but through lived example. So, what personal lesson can we take from this emotional story? Perhaps it's that dignity is not tied to what we wear, where we shop, or how we're perceived. It's tied to how we treat others, especially those we think have nothing to offer us. And perhaps the real measure of character isn't in the applause we receive, but in the compassion we show when no one's clapping. If this story moved you, let it be more than a pleasant read. Let it be a call to look again, listen better, and judge less. Share it, talk about it, and live its message. Because in the end, what the world truly needs isn't more noise. It's more touching stories, more justice stories, and more people willing to start those quiet, lasting waves of justice, one small act of humanity at a time.